What is up, world? It's your boy Ton, and you are listening to the Wonton Wealth Podcast. Here, I'm going to unravel anything and everything commercial real estate related. And more importantly, we're going to add abundant value. So if you're ready, buckle up your eardrums. What is up, people? Today I have an absolute badass for you guys, Juan DeLuna. I got introduced to Juan by a buddy of ours, a mutual friend, Logan Freeman. Shout out to Logan. He mentioned that Juan is the person to talk to when it comes to data centers. And from my perspective, I don't know shit about data centers, and I don't think a lot of people do. So hopefully today is going to add a ton of value. Juan, thank you for joining us. Please give us a brief background on who you are and what you're currently doing now.
Absolutely. Hey, Tan, I appreciate you having me on the call today, and looking forward to the conversation. So essentially, a little background about myself is I've got about 9+ years in the data center industry. Roughly about $10 billion worth of infrastructure oversight influence on those projects. Also carry a professional designation through ANSI/BICSI. For those that are familiar, I do have a DC. So essentially, my background's coming from those 9 years of enterprise data center industry works, and essentially supporting those projects through to the finish line. I've worked with around mission critical environments with uptime resiliency, utility reliability, infrastructure planning, which are all non-negotiables, right? When you're in this space, that experience gives Stroff Capital basically the practical perspective on these. Essentially, we do not approach site diligence from purely a real estate viewpoint. We look at it through the lens of the future operations, the utility requirements, infrastructure constraints, and deployment timelines. So frankly, the role here is to help data center developers, off takers, and land developers in this powered land space avoid surprises before they become actual problems. So a little background on the market. We source land deals directly from landowners directly, or from commercial companies that come to us, and they essentially kind of want to see if it has data center development potential. On the market opportunity side, it's obvious. The headlines are every day, right? You're probably really familiar with a lot of talk on the news. It's the hyperscalers, AI providers, cloud operators, co-location companies. They're actively seeking capacity, right? But what we're seeing in the market is that the demand is no longer the primary constraint. The constraints are wrapped around power availability, utility timelines, permitting complexity, and even some of the environmental and community acceptance challenges, right? Before you can actually get to becoming the true, accepting the actual true bottlenecks. A parcel may look attractive on paper, but if in this case, if the power delivery is delayed by years, or zoning creates entitlement challenges, or opportunity quickly deteriorates, that's why the site readiness matters more than site availability at this point. Being in the commercial real estate space, Tan, I'm pretty sure that kind of resonates well with you and all the users and the viewers that are watching this podcast, right?
Yeah, 100%. I think it feels like it's one of those where even if you have the land, you can't really make it into a data center, right? It has to have all the bells and whistles that come with that land in order for it to be turned into a data center. So even if you're sitting on some land, it could be not suitable, or it could be worth dog shit, right?
Right. Yeah. And like I said, we go through about 15 to 20 land deals a week, which is pretty large volume, right? There's a lot of projects and parcels that are never going to meet the criteria, from a standards perspective, and even from a development standpoint. So it's important to note, right? The other thing is, when we talk about across the United States, just for an example, more than 50% of all data center projects across the United States have been significantly delayed or flat out canceled. Um, you start looking at those numbers, that's pretty high. And most of the project failures don't occur during construction; they actually occur much earlier. Community pushback. I routinely see projects struggle because of utility assumptions that they were inaccurate, interconnection timelines that were misunderstood, environmental conditions that weren't fully evaluated, or just entitlement complexities altogether that just weren't properly identified from the beginning. When it comes to that, whether a site can be eventually developed, the question is whether it can be developed within the required budget and schedule. And that's kind of where we outline and how I handle stuff on the consulting side is, it's a process designed to uncover those issues before any kind of acquisitions or decision makers move forward. And it's more of a decision of confidence or walk away before the costs actually accumulate. So
So
yeah.
are you seeing a lot of outside of the fact that, let's say, you don't have the the power infrastructure there? Sometimes there's a cost to actually bringing that power there. But I want to talk about the constraints that you're seeing from like the neighborhood perspective, like the zoning and permitting and the neighbors just not really wanting a data center to be there. Like currently we're seeing signs in my neighborhood. I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, that they're saying like no data centers. Like why is there so much pushback from people for data centers being in the neighborhood?
I'm glad you asked that question. And frankly, I've told a lot of folks. I said there's two distinct factors here, right? There's the good operators that are not getting talked about, and then the bad operators are the ones that are making the headlines, right? So bad news is always going to sell first, right? And unfortunately, the bad operators are the ones kind of giving the industry a bad name. And a lot of it has to do with, they didn't plan things properly. If, for example, somebody filed for a data center project, and then, it's going to community hearings where there's community involvement and input on those projects. When you don't have certainty around how the project is going to be designed or essentially built out, those become key considerations, right? As far as pushback from the community. For example, there's a lot of red tape and discussion around water, right? Everybody's pushing back and saying, well, they're gonna. One commissioner, I remember, a little while back, they were actually on the news, frankly, and they called they called data centers a giant refrigerator that swallows up a whole bunch of water. Um, you know that is far from the truth. I'll say that to some extent, right? Most depending on the way the cooling solution is designed for a data center, and that happens at the very very beginning stages of what we call program design, right? Where you're kind of figuring out like, okay, I'm doing site selection for a new data center site. Certain markets are going to have different types of cooling strategies that you'll be able to implement for your site, but those should be key consideration items that are done at the site selection stage. And that comes even from the community involvement standpoint. So where I'm getting at here is, if you're in a community where you've got a pretty good zoning board and essentially a good through process on how they handle those entitlements, right? To get you to pre-construction and construction drawings, and then finally to entitlements. There's a good chance that if you structure your deal accordingly and you've got all your information in a row, it presents minimal challenges. Now there are some parts even of Ohio that you were talking about. I'm actually working with a project sponsor right now on a deal that is actually in Ohio. But this part of Ohio doesn't have they don't have zoning. In this area, so those are kind of things that get eliminated, right? So in that retrospect, it just depends, right? I've seen operators try to go and find land too much of a rural location, and that heavily influences the design of the data center, right? First you're talking about there's 4 tier rating levels for a data center from Uptime Institute, right? So it goes from tier 1 all the way to tier 4. The higher you go up in tiers, the more expensive that data center is going to be to build, because of the complexities and the redundancies that have to be built into it. But hopefully, I didn't mean. I think I drifted there a little bit on that one, but hopefully it kind of gives you a little more insight on that. So incorporating that design into site selection, along with figuring out what your community involvement is going to look like, definitely impacts your project from the beginning start standpoint, from getting off the ground.
So essentially, when you have a site that's kind of ready to go, or being primed to being built into a data center, you have to have all these things kind of already laid out from a due diligence perspective. If it's well, the biggest thing is probably power, and then the next thing is probably connectivity, and obviously we touched on zoning a little bit. And we're on this slide here on why so many projects fail, and I see that sometimes costs escalate, and that just comes from probably obviously there's construction costs, infrastructure costs, etc. But does the energy costs sometimes jump up on you in some of these?
So yeah, that's an interesting topic, right? So typically, what happens is, like, a developer would go and get what's called a load impact study from the utility company, because most times when you're doing site selection and even trying to plan out your power strategy story, there's a lot of different avenues that you can go. Like right now, the quickest right now is always going to be behind the meter for right now, which a lot of folks are going towards natural gas, right? For on-site generation. But to give you an idea, if you were to go do a load impact study on your site, from the nearest substation, that costs you several hundreds of thousands of dollars to get done, and depending on the amount of timeline that it takes, that study itself could take months, or even years when you're in the queue waiting for energization, just depending on the market that you're in. So and then even the equipment shortages is another thing, right? Like if you're doing, everybody's trying to do the behind the meter play, and now there's shortages on natural gas turbines and stuff that runs on natural gas, right? So yeah, it's a little of everything. When you start putting all the pieces together, right? I mean, I've seen projects that get flat out just canceled, and then they've got to move that equipment to another project, or they repurpose it for something else. But yeah, it's a lot to say the least, on that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's a ton of moving parts here. You kind of have to know the whole life cycle of how energy gets pushed to your site in order to make sure all your ducks are in a row, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And the interesting thing is that the markets provided plenty of examples showing that even the sophisticated developers can encounter significant challenges, right? Projects that are backed by some of the largest organizations in the data center industry, they're experiencing delays, withdrawals, and even schedule impacts that are kind of drawing back. So those examples, demonstrate that the capital alone doesn't eliminate the risk, and utility readiness, permitting pathways, infrastructure availability, and local conditions. They all have to be aligned, right? And essentially where we kind of step in, and from my standpoint is, my objective is to kind of help my clientele identify those variables early, so they can make an informed decision about acquisitioning it or going further, than reactive corrections later.
That's where you come in. That's the
Mhm.
expertise, and
Yeah,
hoping to help these larger developers, or any developer in general, kind of avoid some of these mistakes. Because I
that's right.
or I think some of these mistakes are going to be very, very costly. Am I right?
Oh yeah, yeah, no, expensive, very expensive. I'll give you one example. I had a land developer come to me, and they told me, "Hey, I want to build a data center on this land, and let's try and make it work." And you know, to some extent, looking at it from a standard standpoint, if those discussions kind of had started before they actually purchased the land, and then I think they would have been in a bit of a different position. But that's essentially where Stroft Capital kind of creates the value, right? So before they commit to a site, we help answer their four fundamental questions, right? So, can the infrastructure support the intended deployment or project? Um, are the land constraints that impact the development, right? What does the energy picture look like today and in the future, right? Because that's also an impact if you're utilizing a lot of energy for some of these sites. Now that we're talking about getting on the gigawatt scale, and most importantly, should this site move forward at all? Clearly my goal is to essentially validate every opportunity, but at the same time, both opportunities and the risk, so that capital is allocated intelligently. Um, but yeah, that's essentially where we do that proper site assessment, site selection, assistance, and consulting services. And of course, we go through a lot of deal flow, right? So folks kind of ask them like, hey, how are you able to go through so many deals a week? Well, we've got proprietary solutions that I've essentially built out. I've got a heavy system engineering and IT background. Built a lot of my own tools, automated data centers, essentially we basically built a flagship tool that is designed for organizations that need the informed assessment before spending significant money on the land acquisition, engineering, or even the entitlement work. And it focuses primarily on those three core items. The infrastructure analysis reporting, which is a just general high level look of what's going on at a site, if you want to pursue it. And then, of course, a full on land package assessment. And that's where, we start kind of getting ingrained onto the standard side of things, and if the site's even going to meet what kind of requirements we're looking at. And I think we touched on, some of these tier ratings. Most of what, some of the operators that we're seeing is, they're kind of having to relay towards this. You hear triple, you hear 5 nines, thrown around very very loosely, right? So 5 nines, what that means is downtime of less than about 4 minutes of downtime. From an Uptime Institute standpoint, on the ANSI Bixby scale as well, as we look at it at a tier 3, tier 4 kind of requirement on the implications, right? One mistake we frequently see with evaluating sites without first understanding the operational requirements for the future facility is figuring out the tier requirement for the site, right? That is going to be one of the driving factors of your data center. Prime example, Tan, I can tell you. I had one land developer come to me. They had a site that was 2 rule, and essentially we started with tier 3 requirements. And then as we got further into figuring out, okay, what about the intangible costs, like getting skilled labor to the site to do the work, right? Most folks, when they're seeing that, hey, this data center is only employing 35 people, they don't see all the other people that are employed behind that. These data center operators and landlord owners, they're not in the energy business. They're not in the HVAC business. Some of them may be in the energy portion of it when they resell wholesale back to the grid, but that's a whole nother story. For the main part, if you can't get specific skilled labor to the site in time to work on things when they fail, it's going to impact how you're gonna run the site. So in this case, right, that rural site was a little too rural. We couldn't. Long story short, we couldn't get an HVAC service company within 5 to 6 hours of the site. That's how rural it was. So when you start looking at the tier rating side of things, you start at a tier 3 requirement, but if you're too rural, now you have to step it up, because if somebody can't get to the site, that's going to impact the reliability and the operations of the data center. And if it affects the operations for that data center, then it's going to impact all the tenants that are sitting inside of it. And if you've got SLAs in place, usually when you lease out to tenants and you lease space in a data center, the one thing that throw around is called an SLA, a service level agreement. And essentially in there, it details out, what you're going to be providing as data center landlord, right? What kind of tier rating and redundancy levels are you providing to my site? And if you're not on those on those kind of spars and pecs, even with your facility, you can run into a lot of trouble. But yeah, so there's quite a few items here that you can see on the tier 3 and tier 4. But what you can see is it requires all aspects. It's not just one, right? You could have, for example, somebody could build out a data center and they say, hey, well, I have a tier 3 data center. It has tier 3 power architecture throughout the whole thing. But I have tier 1 cooling. Well, that means that your data center is now rated at the lowest sub-level system that's supporting it. And it's crazy to think about because, like I said, as you go up in these layers, right? Once you're up at the tier 3 and even tier 4 level, it gets extremely expensive really, really quick, because complexities on how you have to do the redundancy architecture are pretty elaborate. I'll put it that way. Yeah.
So it doesn't even make sense to do like a tier 1 or a tier 2. Like tier 3 and tier 4 is pretty much your only options.
Well, tier 3 and tier 4 is what you're seeing right now from these major hyperscalers. Now, I left tier 1, tier 2 off only because I see more of the tier 3 and tier 4 requirements with everybody talking about 5 nines. Tier 1 essentially is kind of no redundancy. Tier 2 is you got a little bit of a backup. It's what they call an M+1 kind of architecture. But you kind of start having to draw back on some of these things, right? Like for example, you could have a data center that has UPSs in the middle. Then in the event that your power goes out, the UPSs will kick in and power your data center for a little bit, right? It's not long, on a UPS, right? It's just batteries, but that would give you your +1, right? That would essentially be how you handle it. Now, if you add a generator into this, now you've got the continued redundancy portion of, okay, well, I can bounce the power, the power aspect of it from UPS immediately to generator, and I can run on generator as long as I need to until the grid comes back, right? But those architectures are relatively easy to implement to some extent compared to tier 3 and tier 4. Yeah. So
I got 2 questions for you here.
Sure.
One, the first one comes from, you mentioned an SLA, right? Now, me being ignorant of this, it sounds like that with the data center, it means that the tenants are actually someone renting like the compute powering or the computers in and of themselves versus a physical tenant being there. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep.
Got it.
So
Okay.
Yep. So think about it, just like you've got a retail shopping center. That one retail shop is there. That tenant is essentially your triple net, right? It's kind of in the same fashion here, but essentially the tenant is a tech company, right? They bring their own IT, their servers, their equipment. They put it into your data center. They use your power, they use your cooling infrastructure, and they use your internet infrastructure, your telecom, the fiber optics. Basically that's pretty much what it is. And when it comes to the SLA standpoint from it, Tan, is if we, like, for example, let's say we've got a shopping center and or just a rental, a single family rental, right? And let's say on the contract I said, hey, if there's got to be plumbing repairs that are done to the house, right, or any kind of repairs, frankly, that result in an emergency kind of situation, they need to be redressed within 24 hours, right? it's kind of on that same level, right? But a lot more different. It's a lot more ingrained, right? It not to overcomplicate it, but essentially that's what it is. Your tenant's not going to be too happy if it took 3 or 4 days for you to respond and get somebody out there to fix the problem or whatever it may be, right? In the data center world, that's why they have those tier levels to establish a baseline of what the site is going to provide from a service level agreement standpoint.
And that is the first part of my conversation with Juan. Tune in next week for more badass insights. And that's a wrap. If you've made it this far, that means you've listened to the entire episode, so thank you. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening from. And if you've learned something or found it useful, share it with one of your homies. And if you want to get in touch with me, I'm pretty active on IG. My handle is pro_TANH. Reach out, let me know what you liked, what you didn't like, or what you want to hear about in the future. I'm here to tailor this to you. Until next time.